A phone is just a phone. It sits in your pocket. It travels with you everywhere you go. You use it to check in with people you care about, to capture moments you want to remember, to pass the time, to stay connected to everything you don't want to miss. It is the most ordinary object in the modern world, so ordinary that most people stop noticing they're carrying it at all. It is simply there, the way a key is there, the way a wallet is there. It becomes part of you without your thinking about it. But under certain circumstances, the phone becomes something else entirely. Under certain circumstances, the kinds that this episode is about, the phone becomes a witness, a recorder, a device whose camera or microphone happens to be pointed in exactly the right direction at exactly the wrong moment. Not because anyone planned it that way. Not because anyone understood, in the instant the recording began, what it was actually capturing. Sometimes not because anyone even knew the recording was happening at all. And then the phone goes dark. The screen locks. The moment passes. And investigators, weeks or months or years later, open a case file and find inside it something that no one expected to be there. A voice, a face, a hand, a conversation, a few seconds of footage that contains, compressed into its pixels, the answer to the most important question in the investigation. The question of what actually happened on that day, in that place, to that person. This episode is about 5 of those moments. 5 cases where a recording, made without any understanding of its future significance, sometimes by the victim themselves in the last minutes of their life, sometimes by a bystander who simply understood that something wrong was happening and reached for their phone, became the evidence that made everything else possible. The evidence that contradicted a lie. The evidence that placed someone at a scene they claimed never to have visited. The evidence that forced a jury to see, with their own eyes, what the accused had spent months insisting they had not done. Here is something worth sitting with before we begin. Most people, when they think about a criminal trial, imagine evidence in a particular way. Fingerprints, DNA, eyewitnesses, the hard, physical record of a crime. But throughout most of human history, the most common scenario in a murder investigation was this. A person was killed, and the killer was the only person alive who knew the full truth of what happened. That asymmetry between what was done and what could be proven is why so many killers got away with it for so long. They had the advantage of being there. They could shape the narrative. They could fill the absence of evidence with their own account, repeat it and refine until it sounded like the truth. The phone changed that arithmetic. Suddenly, in some cases, the victim was there too, still there, speaking. We are going to move through 5 stories today. Each of them turns on a recording. Each of them contains a moment, a single specific moment, when investigators listened to or watched something and understood that the case had just changed. That the lie that had been holding the investigation in place for days or weeks or years had just collapsed under the weight of a video file or an audio clip that someone's phone had been quietly preserving the whole time. Before we get to the stories, I want to say something about what it means that these recordings exist at all. There is a version of each of these cases that unfolds without the recording. In some of them, that version already nearly happened. The Murdaugh case was nearly closed as a cold case before the voice on Paul's video was identified. The Amo Arbery case went 7 to 4 days without an arrest because the people responsible had enough institutional connections to keep it quiet, and would likely have continued to stay quiet indefinitely if a recording had not been made public. The George Floyd case was actively in the process of being described as a medical incident when the recording that showed what actually happened spread to millions of people overnight. In each of these cases, the truth was at risk of being replaced by a more convenient story. And in each case, a phone prevented that replacement from succeeding. That is not a coincidence. It is a consequence of a technological shift that has altered, in ways we are still in the process of understanding, the relationship between what happens and what can be proven. We live in a world where almost every moment has a potential to be recorded, not because someone decided to document it, but simply because the devices that record are everywhere, all the time, on everyone's person. The implications of that shift are complicated and contested, but in these 5 cases, the implication was straightforward. The truth survived because it was captured before anyone could replace it. These are real people. Their deaths are real. The recordings that documented what happened to them are part of the court record in each of their cases. Facts established through sworn testimony, forensic analysis, and the deliberations of juries who were asked to consider them carefully. We begin in the American South. On a Sunday in June 2021, at a dog kennel on a private hunting estate in Colleton County, South Carolina, with a man who had spent 2 years insisting that he was never there. His name was Alex Murdaugh, and his son recorded him. Times. Story 1. The last video. Paul Murdaugh's recording. South Carolina, June 7, 2021. The Murdaugh name had meant something in coastal South Carolina for nearly 90 years. 3 successive generations of the family had served as the lead prosecutors for the 14th Judicial Circuit, the region covering 5 counties along the state's southern coast, a stretch of marsh and river and dense low-country vegetation that locals call the Low Country, a place with its own particular rhythms and loyalties and a deep communal memory of who holds power and who does not. The Murdaughs had been, in that community, a kind of institution. Not just lawyers, not just political figures. Something closer to an embedded feature of the landscape, a presence so long-standing that people had largely stopped noticing the way you stopped noticing a particular bend in a familiar road. Alex Murdaugh was the latest iteration of that institution. He was a personal injury attorney with a sprawling practice and a family reputation that opened doors before he entered rooms. He was known as a big personality in small spaces, gregarious, charming in the specific way that is useful in courtrooms and at hunting lodges, someone who always seemed to know exactly what the social situation required of him and how to provide it. He had a wife, Maggie. He had 2 sons, Buster, the older, and Paul, the younger. They had a property the family called Moselle, 4,000 acres in Colleton County, with a hunting lodge and dog kennels and the kind of rural space that people with a certain kind of old Southern money tend to accumulate and maintain as a point of identity. And on the evening of June 7, 2021, something happened at those kennels that would take everything the Murdaugh name had built and dismantle it down to its foundation. The evening of June 7th. Paul Murdaugh was 22 years old and had, for the past 2 years, been living under particular weight. In February of 2019, a boat he was allegedly piloting while heavily intoxicated struck a bridge in a nearby county, and a 19-year-old woman named Mallory Beach was killed in the crash. Paul had been charged with boating under the influence causing death. The civil lawsuit that followed had drawn in the broader Murdaugh family in ways that were beginning to create uncomfortable legal complications that touched, specifically, on Alex Murdaugh's finances, on the source of certain settlement funds, on a set of transactions that no one in the family had been asked to fully account for yet. That reckoning was coming. There was a deposition hearing scheduled for the following week in the wrongful death lawsuit, a hearing that would require detailed disclosure of the kind of financial information that Alex Murdaugh did not want disclosed. But on the evening of June 7th, none of that was visible on the surface. The evening, by most accounts, began ordinarily. Alex was at the main house at Moselle. Maggie had driven up from their home in Edisto Beach. Paul was on the property. At around 8:30, Paul called his closest friend, Rogan Gibson. The call was about one of the dogs in the kennel, Cash, Gibson's dog, who was staying temporarily at Moselle. Paul had noticed something off about the dog's tail and wanted Gibson to see it. The cell signal at the rural property was too weak for a clear video call, so Paul told Gibson he would record a video of the dog and send it instead. He pulled out his phone. He pressed record. He pointed it at the kennel where Cash was being kept. The recording began at 8:44 p.m. It lasted less than a minute. It showed Paul trying to get Cash to hold still while he assessed the dog's tail. It captured the background sounds of the kennel at evening, the ambient noise of the property, the sounds of the dogs, and the voices of the other people present. 3 voices, clear enough, in the recording, to be distinguished from one another. Paul's voice, Maggie's voice, and a third voice, identifiable by people who had known the family for years, calling for a yellow lab named Bubba to drop a chicken. The video never reached Rogan Gibson that night. The cell signal at the kennels was insufficient to send it. Gibson called and texted Paul after the failed FaceTime attempt and got no response. He went to bed wondering if his dog was okay. The response never came. By around 9 o'clock that evening, according to the county coroner's estimate, Maggie and Paul Murdaugh had been shot and killed at the dog kennels at Moselle. Maggie was struck multiple times by a rifle. Paul was killed at close range by a shotgun. Neither weapon was ever found. At around 10 o'clock, Alex Modell called 911 to report that he had returned home from visiting his ailing mother and found his wife and son dead. The lie that held for 2 years. From the moment the Colleton County Sheriff's Office arrived at Moselle that night, Alex Modell told investigators a consistent and specific story. He had been in the main house earlier in the evening. He had taken a nap on the couch. He had gotten up and left to drive to Almeda, the family property where his elderly mother lived, to check on her. He had not gone to the dog kennels. He had not seen Maggie or Paul in the 4 to 5 minutes before he left. He returned home and found them. That story was a load-bearing structure of every conversation he had with law enforcement over the following months. He told it to the first officers on the scene. He repeated it when investigators sat down with him formally. He carried it through the early weeks of the investigation, through the media attention, through the community grief, through the memorial service, through the months during which the investigation quietly continued without an arrest. And there was, at first, no physical evidence that conclusively contradicted it. There were inconsistencies. There was a lack of blood on Alex despite the documented violence of the crime scene. There was behavior that investigators noted as unusual. There were cell phone records that created questions about the timing of his movements. There was the fact that the murders came at an extraordinarily convenient moment for a man whose financial situation was about to become the subject of formal legal scrutiny. But there was no single definitive piece of evidence placing him at the kennels, until investigators gained access to Paul's phone. Cracking the phone. Paul's iPhone was locked. The passcode was unknown. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, investigators did not have the technical capability to access its contents. They could see that the phone existed, that it had been found at the scene, that it had been Paul's, but what was inside it was inaccessible. Months passed. The investigation continued, and eventually, forensic analysts of the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division's Computer Crime Center, a unit staffed by specialists in digital forensics, found a way in. They extracted the phone's data. They cataloged what was there, and in that catalog, they found the video Paul had recorded at 8:44 p.m. on the night of June 7th, the video that had been intended for Rogan Gibson, that had never successfully sent, that had been sitting inside a locked phone since the last time Paul Modell was alive to use it. They listened to the audio. 3 voices. Paul, Maggie, and the third voice, the one calling for Bubba to drop the chicken. Lieutenant David Brittendove, a supervisor in the Computer Crime Center who extracted the data from the phone, testified at trial that 3 distinct voices could be heard in the recording. The voices were identifiable by their pitch and cadence as belonging to 3 different individuals. The question was whether anyone who knew Alex Modell's voice could identify the third voice as his. Testifying from the grave. When prosecutors played the kennel video in open court on February 1st, 2023, they had already lined up 2 witnesses who would be asked to identify the voices on the recording. The first was Rogan Gibson, Paul's closest friend, who had known the Modell family since he was a child living next door to them, who had grown up inside their social world, and who had been on the phone with Paul in the minutes before the recording was made. Gibson took the stand and listened to the audio. He was asked whether he recognized the voices. He said he was 100% certain that the 3 voices in the recording were Paul, Maggie, and Alex Modell. The second witness was Will Loving, another close friend of Paul's and of the family. He gave the same answer, 100% certain. Alex Modell watched this testimony from the defense table. He wept. The problem this created for his defense was not merely that 2 witnesses had identified his voice on the recording. The problem was what that identification meant for the story he had been telling for nearly 2 years. If his voice was in that video, if he was at the kennels at 8:44 p.m., then every statement he had made to law enforcement about not being at the kennels that evening, about not seeing Maggie and Paul in the 4 to 5 minutes before he left for his mother's house, about waking up alone from a nap and departing without going near the kennels, all of it was a lie. And the murders, according to the county coroner's timeline, occurred around 9 o'clock, 15 minutes after Paul's phone stopped recording. Alex Modell eventually took the stand in his own defense and admitted, under the pressure of the evidence, that he had been at the kennels that evening. He said he had lied to investigators. He offered an explanation for why he had lied that the jury evaluated alongside the full weight of the evidence against him. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They found him guilty of both murders. The state attorney general, who was part of the prosecuting team, told reporters after the verdict was announced, the kennel video hung him. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He was 54 years old. The lead prosecutor described what the recording represented in terms that went beyond the legal significance of a single piece of evidence. He said that in a murder case, victims can't testify. But in this case, they did. They left something behind that let you know what happened to them. Paul's video was Paul testifying from the grave. The financial collapse and what the murders were meant to prevent. The investigation into the murders eventually revealed the full scope of what Alex Murdaugh had been carrying in the years leading up to June 7th. He had, over a period of years, stolen approximately $8 million from clients at his law firm, including settlement funds belonging to people who had trusted him to protect their interests, including the estate of his family's housekeeper Gloria Satterfield, who had died after a fall at Moselle and whose wrongful death settlement Alex had diverted into accounts under his control. That last detail, the Satterfield theft, speaks to something important about the nature of what Alex Murdaugh was doing beneath the surface of his life. Gloria Satterfield had worked for the Murdaughs for years. She was someone Maggie and Paul knew. Her family trusted Alex to handle the settlement that arose from the wrongful death lawsuit following her accident at their property. He handled it by routing approximately $4 million of that settlement into accounts he controlled, leaving Satterfield's sons with virtually nothing while maintaining the fiction, for years, that the case had been resolved in their favor. This was not desperation theft. It was not someone who stumbled into financial crime in a moment of crisis. It was systematic, sustained, and conducted by a person whose professional identity was built entirely on being trusted with other people's most vulnerable moments. The civil proceedings connected to the Mallory Beach boat crash lawsuit were, according to prosecutors, a gathering storm, a set of legal proceedings that would have required disclosure of financial records that would have exposed the full extent of his theft, the full scope of what he had been doing for years behind the institution of the Murdaugh name. The jury was permitted to hear evidence of those financial crimes because the prosecution argued, and the judge agreed, that they established a motive, that the murders of Maggie and Paul were committed not in a moment of passion or family conflict, but as a calculated attempt to generate a crisis that would distract attention from what was about to come to light, to buy time, to change the subject. The jury that heard all of this, the financial crimes, the voice on the kennel video, the inconsistencies in the story Alex told about where he had been that night, deliberated for less than 3 hours. Craig Moyer, one of the jurors who agreed to speak publicly after the verdict, said it clearly. It was a video that convinced him. He could hear the voice. He knew what it meant. Alex Murdaugh was taken into custody after the verdict and has remained there. He was subsequently indicted by a federal grand jury on 22 counts of financial crimes and pleaded guilty to those charges in September 2023. He faces additional federal time beyond the state life sentences. A year after his murder conviction, a former court clerk named Becky Hill was arrested on charges of jury tampering during the trial, an event that briefly reopened the question of whether Murdaugh might get a new trial. His attorneys argued that Hill had communicated improperly with jurors about their deliberations and pressured them toward a guilty verdict. A new hearing on those claims was scheduled, and as of early 2026, the appeal is still working its way through the courts. A separate trial court judge denied the motion for a new trial in January 2024, but further appeals remain possible. Alex Murdaugh remains in prison. The Murdaugh family name, that institution that had stood in coastal South Carolina for nearly 90 years, stands for something quite different now. Paul Murdaugh's phone is in evidence storage. The video it contains, less than a minute long, taken to show a friend that his dog was doing fine, is part of the permanent court record of what happened at Moselle on the evening of June 7, 2021. It is the last recording Paul ever made. It solved his own murder. Times. Story TWO. The witness Donna LaFrazier and George Floyd, Minneapolis, Minnesota, May 25, 2020. She was 17 years old. She had gone to the corner store to buy snacks with her 9-year-old cousin. That is a full biographical context for what happened next. A teenager, a Monday evening. A trip to Cup Foods on the corner of 38th Street and Chicago Avenue in the Powderhorn neighborhood of South Minneapolis. Not a photojournalist. Not an activist. Not someone who had decided to bear witness to anything. Someone who was buying snacks. The emergency lights outside the store were the first sign that something was happening. She saw them through the window. She sent her cousin inside and went to see what was going on. She saw a man on the ground. She saw a police officer kneeling on the man's neck. She heard the man saying that he couldn't breathe. She reached into her pocket and took out her phone and pressed record. It was 8:19 in the evening of May 25th, 2020. The recording ran for 10 minutes and 9 seconds. George Floyd. George Perry Floyd Jr. was 4 to 6 years old. He had grown up in Houston's CUNY Homes public housing project and had moved to Minneapolis in 2014 for a fresh start after a period of difficulty in Texas. By the spring of 2020, he was working as a security guard at a restaurant called Conga Latin Bistro, work that had dried up when the COVID-19 pandemic forced the city's businesses to close. He was known to the people in his life as a large and gentle man who called people brother, who had the kind of presence that made a room feel warmer and smaller. He was someone's father. He was someone's son. On the evening of May 25th, a store employee at Cup Foods called 911 to report that a customer had passed a counterfeit $20 bill, an offense so minor that it rarely results in any significant police response. Officers Thomas Lane and J. Alexander Queuing arrived first. They found Floyd sitting in a car parked nearby. What happened in the next minute? Floyd's behavior at the car window, the initial physical struggle, the events leading to him being placed face down on the pavement, is documented in body camera footage, in the accounts of multiple witnesses, in the medical examiner's report, and in the 10-minute recording that a 17-year-old made on her phone. By 8:19, when Darnella Frazier began recording, Floyd was already on the ground. Officer Derek Chauvin, a 19-year veteran of the Minneapolis Police Department, had his left knee pressed against Floyd's neck. Floyd was handcuffed behind his back. His face was against the asphalt. He said he couldn't breathe. He said his stomach hurt. He said his neck hurt. He said everything hurt. He called out for his mother. He said please. He asked them not to kill him. 9 minutes and 29 seconds. The Hennepin County Medical Examiner later documented the duration of Chauvin's restraint at 9 minutes and 29 seconds. For more than 9 minutes, as Floyd lay on the ground saying he couldn't breathe, and then saying less and then saying nothing, as his body went limp and then went entirely still, as the other officers present did not intervene, as bystanders on the sidewalk called out to Chauvin to check for a pulse, to get off the man, to let him breathe. For all of that time, Chauvin maintained the same position. He looked at the crowd. His expression, as multiple witnesses described it independently, was one of absolute indifference. Not agitation, not conflict, not the face of someone in the middle of a difficult and deteriorating situation. The face of someone who was entirely certain of what he was doing and entirely unbothered by anyone's response to it. An off-duty firefighter named Genevieve Hansen came to the scene during the restraint. She identified herself as a medical professional and asked to check Floyd's pulse. She was told to stay back. She described, in her trial testimony, the agony of standing there with medical training she was not being permitted to apply while she watched someone die. Darnella Frazier stood on the sidewalk with her phone recording for the full duration. She was, throughout those 10 minutes, both a 17-year-old on a sidewalk watching something horrific and something else, something she did not have a word for yet, something she was doing instinctively, because she understood at some level that what she was seeing needed to be recorded, that the recording mattered, even if she could not have said why with any precision in that moment. When Floyd's body was loaded onto a stretcher and carried away, she stopped recording. That night, she posted a video on Facebook, the police report and the video. The next morning, the Minneapolis Police Department issued a press release describing what had happened on the corner of 38th and Chicago the previous evening. The press release described it as follows. A man had died after a medical incident during a police interaction. It noted that he had appeared to be suffering medical distress and had been transported to a hospital where he later died. It made no mention of Chauvin's knee on Floyd's neck. It made no mention of 9 minutes and 29 seconds of sustained restraint. It made no mention of the words Floyd said while he was on the ground. It presented what had happened in language so clinical and so carefully constructed that it concealed the event almost entirely. The video dismantled that language word by word. By the morning of May 26, Darnella Frazier's recording had spread far beyond her Facebook page. By May 27th, it had been seen by millions of people in the United States and internationally. By May 29th, Derek Chauvin had been arrested and charged with third-degree murder. The The broader scope of charges came shortly after. This progression: police press release, video contradict press release, video spreads, arrest follows, took 4 days. The speed of it was unprecedented. The accountability that arrived in those 4 days was, as Minnesota Governor Tim Walz later said of the recording, something that might otherwise never have arrived. The trial and the testimony. Derek Chauvin's murder trial began in late March 2021 and concluded on April 20th with guilty verdicts on all 3 counts: second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. He was sentenced to 22 years in prison. The Frazier recording was played for the jury multiple times throughout the proceedings. It was a centerpiece of the prosecution's case not because it was the only evidence. There was body camera footage from the officers involved. There was expert medical testimony. There was forensic evidence. But because it showed, with a directness and an immediacy that no other piece of evidence could match, what had happened. Not reconstructed. Not described. Not interpreted. Shown. Darnella Frazier testified. She was 18 by the time of the trial. She sat in the witness chair and described, in a voice that broke more than once, what she had seen standing on that sidewalk. She described Floyd as terrified. She described him as suffering. She described his pain as visible and as real. And she described what it had cost her to stand there and record it, the night she had spent afterward unable to sleep, going over it in her mind, asking herself if she had done enough, if there was something more she could have done, if the fact that she had stood there with a phone and not physically intervened was a failure. The court's response, the jury's response, the response of the people watching the testimony, was to tell her clearly that what she had done was not a failure, that what she had done had changed the outcome of this case and, potentially, the outcomes of cases that had not yet happened. She was awarded a special Pulitzer Prize citation in 2021 for, in the language of the board, courageously documenting the murder of George Floyd, an act of witness that had global impact. She was a teenager buying snacks. What the recording changed. The George Floyd case and the verdict in Derek Chauvin's trial are among the most consequential events in the recent history of American policing. The months that followed Floyd's death saw the largest racial justice protests in the country's documented history. Demonstrations in all 50 states and in cities across Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia. Reforms to use-of-force policies were enacted in jurisdictions across the United States. In Minneapolis itself, the police department's budget was cut and a long process of reimagining public safety was set in motion. A national conversation about accountability in law enforcement, about who is held responsible for what and under what circumstances, was forced into the open in a way that had not happened before in recent memory. None of that, as many people noted explicitly in real time, would have been possible if there had been no video. If the only account of what happened on the corner of 38th and Chicago on the evening of May 25th, 2020, were the account that the Minneapolis Police Department offered in its press release the following morning, the medical incident, the police interaction, the person in distress who was transported and who later died, there would have been no trial. There would, almost certainly, have been no arrest. There would have been the story that was constructed to replace the truth, and there would have been nothing strong enough to knock it over. The recording knocked it over. Not because Darnella Frazier was trying to be a journalist. Not because she had planned to document anything. Not because she understood in that moment the full scope of what she was capturing. But because she saw something wrong happening, and she reached for her phone, and she kept the recording going for 10 minutes and 9 seconds even though she was also a frightened teenager watching a man die and unable to do anything to help him. The NAACP of North Carolina, in a statement following Chauvin's conviction, compared her recording to the Zapruder film, the home movie Abraham Zapruder made of President Kennedy's motorcade in Dallas in 1963, which became the most important documentary record of that day despite being made by a man who simply showed up with a camera and pointed at a parade. In both cases, an ordinary person, an unremarkable object, and a moment that history needed someone to record. The difference is what was recorded and what it proved. Zapruder's film documented an assassination that everyone already knew had occurred. Frazier's recording documented a killing that an official police statement had attempted to describe as a medical incident. It didn't just preserve history. It corrected the record. It replaced the official account with a true account, in real time, before the official account could fully solidify. The NAACP of North Carolina, in a statement following Chauvin's conviction, made a comparison that many others have since repeated. They likened Frazier's recording to the Zapruder film, the home movie that a businessman named Abraham Zapruder made of John F. Kennedy's motorcade in Dallas in November 1963, and that became, unexpectedly, the most important documentary record of one of the most significant events in American political history. The comparison is instructive. In both cases, an ordinary person with a camera was in the wrong place at the wrong time, doing something entirely unremarkable, and captured something that would have remained hidden or distorted had the camera not been there. The difference is that Frazier's camera was a phone. And phones, by 2020, were everywhere. Chauvin is serving his sentence at a federal prison. In December 2021, he entered a guilty plea to separate federal civil rights charges in connection with Floyd's death, as well as charges related to a 2017 incident in which he knelt on the neck of a 14-year-old during an arrest. The guilty plea came with an agreement to cooperate with federal authorities in their broader investigation of civil rights violations. Darnella Frazier is 22 years old. She has described living with a weight of what she saw and what she recorded. She has spoken about the difficulty of a life in which you are permanently associated with one of the most traumatic events of the past decade, in which strangers approach you to express gratitude or to say terrible things, in which a moment you did not plan for and did not choose has become the defining fact of your public identity. She testified that she spent nights afterward staying up and apologizing to George Floyd for not doing more, for not physically intervening, for not saving his life. Even though she was a teenager, even though intervention was not within her power, even though what she did with her phone was more consequential than anything else she could have done in that moment. She has not stopped speaking about it. She continues to insist that what happened to George Floyd was wrong, and that the world needed to see it. That the recording was the right thing to do, even with everything that followed. Times. Story 3. The Accidental Record. Amo Arbery, Brunswick, Georgia, February 23, 2020. The man who filmed this killing had thought the video would help the killers. That is a central and extraordinary irony of the Amo Arbery case, that the recording which ultimately resulted in 3 convictions and 3 life sentences was made by one of the people being charged, a man named William Rod Bryan, who believed when he hit record that the footage he was capturing would demonstrate that what the McMichaels had done was justified, that it would be exculpatory, that it would show the world what they had seen and confirm that the use of force had been warranted. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about it in a way that he did not fully understand until the video began to circulate publicly, and the reaction it generated was the opposite of everything he had expected. By then it was too late to UN record it. Amo Marquez Arbery. Amo Arbery was 25 years old. He had grown up in Brunswick, Georgia, the coastal city near the Florida border that sits in the heart of Glynn County. He ran for exercise, frequently, regularly, often in the morning or the afternoon along the routes he knew through his neighborhood and the surrounding areas. Running was something he had done since high school, where he had played football. It was a constant in his life. He had, in the weeks before February 23rd, jogged through the Satilla Shores neighborhood more than once. The neighborhood was a residential area of modest single-family homes near the Brunswick Waterway. It was also, at the time, a neighborhood in the middle of change. There were new homes under construction, and there had been a series of neighborhood discussions about property crime, about security, about who belonged in the neighborhood and who didn't. Those discussions had a racial dimension that was never fully separated from the conversations about crime. Satilla Shores was overwhelmingly white. Arbery was a young black man. On February 23rd, he was running. He passed by an unfinished house under construction at 220 Satilla Drive that he had stopped to look at on previous runs. Security footage from a camera installed at the construction site showed him walking through the open frame of the building, looking around for a few minutes, and then leaving without taking anything. The property owner, who was 90 miles away at the time, later confirmed that nothing had ever been stolen from the site, that no crime had ever been reported there. As Arbery was leaving the construction site, Gregory McMichael, a 64-year-old retired Glynn County police officer and former investigator in the local district attorney's office, saw him from across the street. McMichael had been watching the neighborhood. He knew that there had been a recent burglary in the area. He believed, based on nothing more than what he saw through a window, that Arbery was the person responsible. He called to his son Travis. They grabbed their firearms and got into their pickup truck. The pursuit, What followed across the next several minutes has been documented in body camera footage, in multiple witness accounts, in the video that Brian eventually made, and in the testimony of the men who were involved. Gregory McMichael called 911. He told the dispatcher that there was a black male running down the street. He said the man had been breaking into houses. He had no evidence of this. He had watched a man leave a construction site and assumed. The McMichaels drove their white pickup truck in the direction Arbery had run. Their neighbor, William Bryan, saw them pursuing someone and decided, on impulse, to join. He got in his own vehicle and fell in behind them. What the pursuit looked like from the outside was this: a man running on a residential street in a neighborhood he had every right to be in, pursued by two vehicles being driven by people he did not know, carrying people who were armed and who were shouting at him to stop. Arbery ran. He tried to get around the trucks. The trucks repositioned to cut him off. He tried another direction. They followed. The pursuit covered approximately a quarter of a mile. Brian, following in his own vehicle, pulled out his phone at some point during the chase and pressed record. When Travis McMichael's truck finally stopped in the road ahead of Arbery, blocking his path, and Travis stepped out with a shotgun, the confrontation that followed lasted seconds. Arbery moved around the front of the truck, trying to get past. There was a physical struggle at the front of the vehicle. 3 shots were fired. Arbery collapsed in the road. He died at the scene. 7 to 4 days. What did not happen in the immediate aftermath is as important as what did. No arrests were made. Gregory McMichael, by virtue of his connections to the local district attorney's office, he had retired from position as an investigator in that office, was in phone contact with the district attorney within an hour of Arbery's death. The district attorney later recused herself from the case, citing that connection. 2 successor prosecutors also declined to press charges, offering written opinions suggesting that the McMichaels had been acting within the bounds of Georgia citizens' arrest law. Those opinions cited Arbery's prior convictions and speculated about his mental state in ways that Arbery's family and attorneys described as an attempt to posthumously criminalize a victim. One of those written opinions, from the second prosecutor who reviewed the case, described Arbery's behavior at the construction site and during the chase in terms that, when read against the video evidence and the property owner's testimony that nothing had ever been stolen, are difficult to reconcile with the facts. The opinion suggested Arbery was responsible for the violent encounter. It suggested the men chasing him in trucks had acted lawfully. It recommended no charges. 7 to 4 days passed. Arbery's mother, Wanda Cooper Jones, spent those 7 to 4 days trying to find someone in the legal system who would take the case seriously. She said in an interview that she never thought she would see an arrest. She said she believed the men who killed her son would walk free because of who they knew. Then the video became public. The leak. On May 5, 2020, 71 days after Arbery's death, 3 days before the 74th day mark at which the case would have aged past a significant legal threshold in Georgia, a local attorney with ties to the McMichael family released a video that Brian had recorded, apparently under the belief that seeing the footage would generate public sympathy for the McMichaels by showing how dangerous the confrontation had been. The reaction was the opposite of what was intended. The video showed, in footage that is brief but impossible to misread, a man in running clothes trying to get around a truck that was blocking his path, and the moment immediately before and after he was shot. It showed the posture of the encounter. It showed what it looked like. It did not show a dangerous criminal being subdued. It showed what Wanda Cooper Jones had been saying for more than 2 months. It showed the hunting and killing of her son. The video reached the Georgia governor's office within days. The governor formally requested FBI involvement on May 10th. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation took over the case from local authorities. On May 7th, 2 days after the video became public, Gregory and Travis McMichael were arrested. Brian was arrested on May 21st. The words of Cooper Jones afterward are unambiguous about what the recording meant. She said plainly, in an interview months later, that without the video there would have been no arrests, and without the arrests, no trial. The video was the reason. It was the only thing that cut through the network of local connections and legal opinions and institutional inertia that had allowed 7 to 4 days to pass without accountability. The trial and the verdict. The trial of Gregory McMichael, Travis McMichael, and William Bryan began in November 2021. The prosecution's case rested on a central argument that the men had no legitimate basis to pursue Arbery, that the citizens' arrest law under which they claimed to be acting required an actual witnessing of a crime, not a suspicion, not an assumption, but a witness crime, and that they had not witnessed one. They had seen a man run out of an unfinished building. That was all. The property owner testified that nothing had been stolen from his site. There were no reports of any crime. Arbery had not been doing anything illegal when the McMichaels decided to pursue him in an armed vehicle. The defense attempted to argue self-defense, that once a physical confrontation at the front of the truck began, Travis McMichael was justified in firing because he believed his life was in danger. The prosecution countered that the men had created the situation themselves by pursuing an unarmed man in vehicles, that Arbery's attempts to get around the truck were not aggression but a response to being trapped, and that the force used was not defensive but offensive. Brian's video was played for the jury. The jury asked, during deliberations, to see two specific clips from the footage. Those clips captured the final moment of the confrontation. The jury deliberated for approximately 10 hours over 2 days. On November 24, 2021, they returned guilty verdicts against all 3 defendants. Travis McMichael was convicted on all counts, including malice murder. Gregory McMichael and Brian were convicted on felony murder and additional charges. Both McMichaels were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Brian was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole, a distinction reflecting both the jury's finding on his specific intent and the judge's assessment of his relative culpability. In a federal trial in early 2022, all 3 men were additionally convicted of hate crimes and attempted kidnapping, with federal prosecutors successfully arguing that Arbery had been targeted because of his race. At the sentencing hearing, Judge Timothy Walmsley held a moment of silence before reading the sentences. He said it represented a fraction of the time Ahmaud Arbery had been running in his neighborhood before he was stopped. The irony at the center of it: William Bryan made the recording because he thought it would show that what happened was justified. He was present at the killing of Ahmaud Arbery because he made a split-second decision on seeing his neighbors in pursuit of a runner to join them in his truck. He was convicted of felony murder in part because his presence contributed to the trap that Arbery could not escape from. And the footage he took, which he apparently believed would demonstrate that a confrontation was dangerous and the response proportionate, instead showed the world what 3 men in trucks do to an unarmed person who is simply trying to run. The recording that was meant to protect the perpetrators convicted them. Brian cooperated with law enforcement after the arrest, a cooperation that prosecutors and the judge acknowledged in distinguishing his sentence from the McMichaels. He received life with the possibility of parole, meaning he will be eligible to seek release after 30 years, while the McMichaels received life without any possibility of parole. Brian expressed, through his attorneys and in statements after the verdict, what they characterized as genuine remorse for his participation in the events of February 23rd. Georgia subsequently repealed and replaced its citizens' arrest law, the legal framework that the McMichaels had invoked as justification for their pursuit, in May 2021, just over a year after Arbery's death. The new law significantly restricted the circumstances under which private citizens could detain others and explicitly address the kind of armed vehicular pursuit that led to Arbery's killing. The legislation passed with bipartisan support. February 23rd is now observed in Georgia as Ahmaud Arbery Day. He was 25 years old. He was running. There is a legal principle that evidence speaks for itself. It is an old principle, predating cameras and phones by centuries. But there is something particular about video evidence, about the specific way it removes the mediating layer of human description that gives it a weight that other kinds of evidence rarely have. You can argue with what a witness says they saw. You can question their memory, their perspective, their bias. You cannot have the same argument with a video. The video shows what it shows. The only question is whether you are willing to see it. Times. Story 4. The Last Photograph. Tyler Ryan, Rexburg, Idaho, September 8, 2019. The last time Tyler Ryan was recorded alive, she was at Yellowstone National Park with her family. It was September 8, 2019. Tyler was 16 years old. The recording was made by a surveillance camera at the park's entrance, footage that shows Tyler getting out of a car and passing through the gate with her mother, Lori Vallow, and her younger brother, 7-year-old Joshua Vallow, who went by JJ. The 3 of them are visible for a few seconds on the camera. They are together. Tyler is alive. By the following day, September 9th, Tylee Ryan was dead. Her remains were later found buried in a shallow pit on the property of her mother's new husband, Chad Daybell, in Rexburg, Idaho. What had been done to them, the manner in which her body had been treated after her death, is documented in the court record and described in terms that investigators, first responders, and the judge who sentenced her mother later characterized as among the most disturbing things they had seen in their careers. The photograph from the park entrance camera is not evidence in the traditional sense. It did not record a crime. What it recorded was the last known image of a 16-year-old girl who was alive and did not know she was in danger, who was with her mother, who had no reason to understand, in that moment of the park entrance, that she had hours left. But it became important. It became part of the timeline. It became one of the fixed points in an investigation that had no body, no confession, no direct witness to the crime. An investigation that had to be built entirely from the circumstantial architecture of what people knew and when they knew it and what their behavior suggested about the truth behind what they were saying. Lori Vallow and the world she had built. Lori Vallow was a woman who had, over the course of the years leading up to September 2019, undergone a transformation that the people who knew her from earlier periods of her life described with consistent bewilderment. She had been a conventionally religious person, a mother who attended church, a woman whose daily life appeared ordinary in the ways that daily life in a close-knit faith community appears ordinary. Then she had encountered a set of fringe religious ideas about dark and light energy, about zombies inhabiting human bodies, about end times prophesies and special spiritual missions, and she had moved with increasing speed and commitment toward a worldview that placed her and the man she had begun a relationship with at its center. That man was Chad Daybell. He was an Idaho author who had written a series of religious novels about apocalyptic scenarios and who had developed, in the years before he met Lori, a following among people drawn to the specific intersection of mainstream faith tradition and millennial prophecy that his books explored. He and Lori had met at a spiritual conference. Their connection was immediate and, by the accounts of people who watched it develop, total, not merely romantic but ideologically enveloping, a mutual reinforcement of beliefs that, outside their shared framework, sounded increasingly detached from the world that other people inhabited. By the summer of 2019, Lori had described her son JJ as a zombie, meaning, in the language he had borrowed and modified from the belief system she now inhabited, that his body had been taken over by a dark spirit and that the person who had been his son was no longer present in the physical form that remained. She made similar statements about her estranged husband, Charles Vallow, who was shot and killed by her brother Alex Cox in July 2019 in what Cox described as self-defense and authorities came to suspect was not. She made statements about other people in her life being dark, being zombies, being obstacles to the mission that she and Chad had been called to fulfill. The chilling logic of that language, when you follow it to its endpoint, is that a zombie is not a person, and what you do to something that is not a person is not murder. The missing children. In November 2019, relatives of J.J. Vallow, who had not been in contact with him for weeks, asked police in Rexburg, Idaho, to conduct a welfare check at the home Lori shared with Chad Daybell. Police went to the house. Neither child was there. Lori told investigators that J.J. was staying with a friend in Arizona. There was no friend in Arizona. Tylee had not been seen by anyone outside Lori's immediate orbit since September. When police returned the following day to continue the inquiry, Lori and Chad were gone. They were found months later in Hawaii, where they had traveled and where, according to investigators, they had been since shortly after police first came to their door asking about the children. The investigation that followed was built on absence. There were no children. There were no bodies, initially. There were two people who kept saying the children were fine, were safe, were with family friends, were traveling. There was a mother who had posted photographs on social media presenting herself as happy and living a new life and who had reported nothing, worried nothing, and behaved publicly in ways that were entirely inconsistent with a parent whose children were missing and unaccounted for. And there was a surveillance photograph from Yellowstone, the last known image of Tylee, which placed her alive on September 8th and established the outer boundary of a window of time in which something had happened. The remains. In June 2020, investigators executed a search warrant on Chad Daybell's property in Rexburg. In the yard, in separate locations, both involving excavated ground, they found the remains of both children. The physical condition of the remains documented what had been done to them. The judge at Lori's sentencing described it in terms that the courtroom heard in silence. The children had been burned and mutilated and dismembered before burial. The degradation of the remains was not consistent with any natural process. It was consistent with deliberate concealment, with an attempt to destroy evidence of what had happened and prevent identification. The presence of duct tape among JJ's remains, to which a strand of hair was adhered, connected Lori Vallow biologically to the physical evidence of the burial site. A DNA expert testified that the hair matched Lori Vallow's DNA profile. The trial, Lori Vallow Daybell's trial, began in April 2023 in Ada County, Idaho. Prosecutors spent 6 weeks presenting evidence that included the surveillance footage from Yellowstone, the DNA evidence from the burial site, the testimony of friends and family members who described Lori's statements about her children being zombies, financial records showing she had continued collecting Social Security benefits on behalf of both children after their deaths, and text messages and recordings that documented the evolution of her beliefs and her relationship with Chad Daybell. The defense's strategy was to suggest that Lori had been under the psychological and theological influence of Chad Daybell, that the beliefs she expressed were, at least in part, his creation, and that her culpability was therefore diminished. They called no witnesses. After the prosecution rested, Lori Vallow Daybell's attorneys announced that the defense would present no case at all. No witnesses. No testimony. Nothing. The jury deliberated for approximately 6 hours across 2 days. They returned a unanimous guilty verdict on all counts, including 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for each child, and 3 counts of conspiracy, including conspiracy to murder Chad Daybell's first wife, Tammy Daybell, who had died in her sleep in October 2019 under circumstances that were later determined to be consistent with suffocation rather than the natural causes initially attributed to her death. Lori Vallow Daybell showed no visible reaction as the verdicts were read. She was sentenced in July 2023 to multiple consecutive terms of life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Judge Stephen Bose addressed her at sentencing with a directness that the courtroom heard without interruption. He said she had chosen the most evil and destructive path possible. He said that despite the overwhelming evidence against her, she had never demonstrated any sign of remorse. He noted the disgust he had seen on the faces of the jurors as they reviewed the evidence about the children's remains. He told her that she had juxtaposed her happiness at a Hawaii honeymoon with her children lying in shallow graves in Idaho. At sentencing, her words, Lori Vallow Daybell was given the opportunity to speak at her sentencing. She spoke for approximately 8.5 minutes. She cited religious texts. She said she had spoken to her children and to Tammy Daybell after their deaths in spiritual communications, and that they were happy and extremely busy in the afterlife. She said that Jesus Christ knew that no one was murdered in this case. The judge then asked her if she was fully satisfied with the representation her attorneys had provided. She said she was. She was transferred to state custody to begin serving her sentences. Chad Daybell was tried separately in 2024 and convicted on all charges, including 3 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death. The trial included testimony, photographs, and forensic evidence of the judge at sentencing. The same Judge Bose who had sentenced Lori, described in terms that made clear he found the totality of what had been done to the children and to Tammy Daybell almost beyond the range of language he was willing to use in open court. He imposed the death penalty. J.J. Vallow, the 7-year-old who was last seen alive in September 2019, had been known to the people in his life as a sweet and energetic child who had been adopted by Lori and her then-husband Charles from a family in Texas. He had special needs and required attentive care that Lori had provided, and that, by every account from the people around them, he had thrived under. He was in 2nd grade. He liked playing. He called his grandfather regularly on the phone, which is how his grandfather eventually noticed he was gone. The children did not run away. They were not in Arizona with family friends. They were in shallow graves on a man's property in Rexburg, Idaho, while their mother was posting photographs of herself on social media and planning a wedding in Hawaii. Tylee Ryan was 16 years old. The last image anyone has of her is from a park entrance camera at Yellowstone. A girl getting out of a car with her mother and her little brother, stepping into a warm September afternoon, with no way of knowing what was coming and no one around her who was going to tell her. The Lori Vallow case is studied in forensic psychology programs in law schools as an example of what researchers call coercive ideological entrapment, the process by which a belief system constructed and enforced within an intimate relationship can produce, in susceptible individuals, a separation from ordinary moral reality so complete that they become capable of actions they would not otherwise have considered. What makes it particularly difficult to process is that the children in this case were not strangers. They were not abstractions. They were her children. The people who knew Lori from earlier in her life described someone who, before the transformation, appeared to love her kids. Which raises a question that this case, and cases like it, leave you with: at what point does ideology become a mechanism for murder? And who is watching for that transition in the people around them? Times. Story 5. The Phone That Kept Listening. Faith Hedgepeth, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, September 7th, 2012. Sometimes a recording does not arrive in time. Sometimes a phone captures something, and the file is preserved, and the people closest to the case know for years that it exists, that there's a record, that there's audio, that the truth of what happened is somehow compressed inside a 3-minute sound file that no one has been able to fully decode, and still the answer takes a decade to arrive. The killing of Faith Hedgepeth is a story about that gap, about the space between the existence of evidence and the ability to use it, about a cold case that stayed cold for 9 years despite the fact that investigators had, from the beginning, a recording that may have captured the approach of the person who killed her. September 7th, 2012. Faith Hedgepeth was 21 years old and a pre-medicine student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She was a member of the Holly-Wissaponi tribe from Hollister, North Carolina, the first member of her family to attend a 4-year university, a person whose plans were specific and whose commitment to them was total. She was studying biology. She wanted to be a doctor. She was someone who called home regularly, who kept up with her family, who had the kind of steady presence that makes other people feel stable around her. On the night of September 6th and into the early morning of September 7th, 2012, Faith went out with her roommate Karina Rosario to a campus nightclub called The Thrill. They had been there before. The evening was unremarkable. Drinks, dancing, the social fabric of a college night out. At some point in the early hours of September 7th, Faith returned to the apartment she shared with Rosario on Hawthorne Lane. What happened between her return and the discovery of her body by Rosario later that morning is what investigators spent 9 years trying to establish. Rosario found Faith in the early afternoon of September 7th. The apartment had been entered. Faith had been beaten. The medical examiner determined that she had died of blunt force trauma to the head. Investigators of the scene found a handwritten note, its content disturbing enough that it was considered potentially significant, left near the body. The pocket dial, among the evidence collected in the initial investigation, was something unusual. Faith Hedgepeth's phone had, at approximately 1:23 in the morning of September 7th, accidentally called the phone of a friend. The call had connected. The friend had been asleep and had not answered, but the voicemail had captured audio. 3 minutes of ambient sound, voices, music in the background, a 3-way conversation between what investigators believed were Faith and 2 other people, 1 male, 1 female. The recording was made without anyone's knowledge. It was a pocket dial, the phone activating and dialing while in Faith's bag or pocket, capturing sound from the environment without any intentional direction. The voicemail was preserved. Investigators had it. Audio analysts worked on it for years, attempting to enhance the voices, attempting to identify the speakers, attempting to extract something specific and actionable from 3 minutes of ambient audio recorded in a noisy environment. It was difficult work. The background noise, music, crowd, the acoustic muffler fabric over a phone speaker made the voices difficult to isolate. Analysts could hear that there were voices. They could hear fragments. They could not, with the technology available in 2012 and the years immediately following, fully resolve the audio into something that could be definitively tied to a specific person. The case went cold. Investigators moved on to other work. Faith's family continued to ask questions. The DNA and the 9U gap. From the beginning, investigators had a DNA profile from evidence collected at the scene. They had a male DNA profile, a complete, workable profile that belonged to whoever had been there when Faith died. What they did not have was a name to match it to. The standard investigative approach in such cases is to run the profile against law enforcement databases. They did. There were no matches. The person whose DNA had been found at the scene had not previously been processed through a system that would have collected their genetic material for law enforcement databases. Every investigative technique available was tried. Persons of interest were identified and their DNA tested. None matched. The note left at the scene was analyzed for linguistic and behavioral clues, and it generated significant investigative attention, including a report released publicly 2 years after the killing that included images of the note and other evidence, documents obtained through a court action by local media outlets. Forensic genealogy was considered as an option, the same technique that had identified the Golden State Killer. Witnesses were re-interviewed. Physical evidence was re-examined with improving technology. In 2016, authorities released a forensic facial composite, an image generated from a crime scene DNA using genetic phenotyping, the technique of predicting physical appearance from genetic markers, which provided investigators and the public with a potential idea of what the person they were looking for might look like. That composite, generated by a private Virginia company at the police department's request, showed a male of mixed ancestry. None of it produced an arrest. And then, in September 2021, 9 years and 1 week after Faith Hedgepeth's death, a man named Miguel Salgolaveras was arrested on a drunk driving charge in Wake County, North Carolina. As part of that arrest, a DNA sample was collected. It matched the profile from Faith's apartment. Salgolaveras was 28 years old. He had not been a suspect in the case at any point during the 9U investigation. Chapel Hill police arrested him on September 16, 2021, on a charge of first-degree murder. In January 2022, additional court documents revealed that his DNA had also been matched to a palm print on the murder weapon found at scene. As of early 2026, Salgolaveras has been charged but not yet tried. The case is in pre-trial proceedings. Prosecutors have indicated they intend to pursue the death penalty. The recording, what it was. The pocket dial recording from Faith's phone has been part of the investigation's evidence since the night she died. What it captured, whether it captured the approach of the person who killed her, whether the voices in the ambient audio are Faith and her killer and someone else, whether the recording contains identifiable sounds that can be tied to specific events, is something that the forthcoming trial will likely address in detail. What is already part of the public record is this. The recording exists. It was made by accident. A phone in a pocket or a bag, bumping against something in the darkness, dialing a number at 1:23 in the morning. 3 minutes of sound. A woman's voice, possibly, and other voices, and music in the background, and then silence as a voicemail ends. For 9 years, that recording existed and the case remained open. And then a routine traffic stop in a neighboring county produced a DNA sample, and the sample matched, and the man who had lived without consequence for 9 years had a name and an address and a court date. Faith's family and the long wait. Faith Hedgepeth's family has been present at every development in this case across 13 years. Her grandmother, her mother, the extended family of a community that had watched one of its own go to college and build a life and die before that life had fully begun. They have spoken publicly about the weight of those years, about the particular exhaustion of grief that does not have resolution, that cannot move through its stages because the story is not finished, because a question of who and why and what exactly happened remains open, because there is a phone recording and a DNA profile and a handwritten note, and still no trial, still no verdict, still no official account of what happened to her daughter in her apartment on the night of September 6th into the 7th, 2012. Faith's grandmother, Margaret Hedgepeth, has been among the most consistent and public voices in the family's long campaign to keep the case in the public consciousness. She attended hearings. She gave interviews. She spoke at events honoring Faith's memory. She said, in multiple contexts over multiple years, that she needed to live long enough to see someone held accountable. She said she would not stop until there was justice for her granddaughter. She was, as of the time of the arrest, in her 80s. The 2021 arrest, when it came, was described by Faith's family and the university community as a moment of relief shadowed immediately by the knowledge that an arrest is not a conviction, that a trial date had to be set, that the evidence had to be presented, that a jury had to deliberate, that the wait was not over, only transformed into a different kind of waiting. The arrest in 2021 was not the end. It was a new beginning of a different phase of the same long wait. A trial date. A set of proceedings that will eventually produce either conviction or an acquittal. A moment, potentially years away still, when a jury will hear the evidence and decide. The pocket dial recording will almost certainly be part of what they hear. 3 minutes of accidental audio from a phone in a bag in the middle of the night. The sound of a life still in progress, captured without design, at 1:23 in the morning on what was about to become the worst night anyone who loved Faith Hedgepeth had ever lived through. Faith was a pre-medicine student. She wanted to be a doctor. She was the first person in her family to attend a 4-year university. She was studying so that she could go back inside a community that had produced her, that had believed in her, that had watched her go and expected her to return. She was 21 years old. Times. Closing. What the recordings say. 5 recordings. 5 moments when a phone was in exactly the right place at exactly the wrong time. A son filming a dog. A teenager stopping on a sidewalk. A neighbor filming what he thought would exonerate him. A park entrance camera capturing the last image anyone has of a 16-year-old girl. A phone in a bag dialing a number by accident at 1 in the morning. None of these recordings were planned. None of them were intended as evidence. None of the people involved, in most cases not even the people holding the phones, understood in the moment that they were capturing something that would matter enormously to the question of what happened and who was responsible. That randomness is not incidental to what these cases mean. It is central to it. The recordings happen because phones are everywhere now, in pockets, in bags, mounted on door frames, attached to dashboards, placed in parking lot corners, held by bystanders who reach for them because something is wrong and they want to document it before it can be unmade. That ubiquity changes the arithmetic of accountability. It doesn't eliminate the gap between what happens and what can be proven, but it narrows it. It gives investigators something that every previous generation of investigators did not have, the possibility that someone was there and was recording and didn't know yet how important it was. And it changes something for the people who commit crimes in the belief that they will not be caught. That belief, in the old world, before these devices were everywhere, was sometimes well-founded. You could commit a crime and be the only witness to it, and spend years constructing an alternative account that filled the absence of evidence with your own story. The new world is different. The new world contains a possibility, not the certainty, but the genuine possibility that a phone was pointing at you at the moment you chose to do what you did, that the decision you made was being documented without your knowledge, that the recording exists somewhere, in someone's phone or in a cloud server or in a parking lot camera archive, waiting to be found. It does not always get found. Plenty of crimes remain unsolved. Plenty of lies hold. The recording changes the odds, not the certainty. But for the families in today's 5 stories, for Wanda Cooper Jones, who waited 74 days and almost didn't get a trial. For the friends and family of Paul Modor, who needed someone to hear his voice and recognize it. For Faith Hedgepeth's grandmother, who spent 9 years waiting for a traffic stop in Wake County to produce a DNA sample. For all of them, the recording mattered. It was the reason justice was possible at all. The people in these 5 cases did not get to choose whether to be recorded, but the recordings gave the rest of us something we would not otherwise have had. The truth. Times. Which of these 5 cases stayed with you most, and what was a specific moment that changed how you were thinking about it? I want to know. Leave it in the comments below. If this episode gave you something real, share it with someone who thinks about these things too. I'll see you in the next one. Times.